Late one evening, the dog behind Martha Pritchard's place started howling again. It was not the kind of barking people ignored in rural Greene County, Tennessee. It came long and thin and rough, rising out of the dark like something hurt and half warning, half grief. Porch lights flicked on up and down the road. Curtains moved. Front doors opened a few inches and stayed there. Folks in that part of the county did not like to call themselves superstitious, at least not in daylight but nighttime, made room for old habits of mind, and Martha's dog had done this before. Not often, 3 or 4 times a year at most, but often enough that people had begun to keep track. A stroke, a farm accident, an old woman who never woke from her sleep. The dog would start up, and within a day or two, somebody nearby would be gone. Martha came out in her cardigan and house shoes irritation already in her voice. "For heaven's sake, Duke, hush." The rusty mutt only raised his muzzle higher and kept going. Across the road, Darlene Whitcomb folded her arms over her robe and said to nobody in particular, "I hate that sound." Her sister-in-law answered from 2 houses down. "You know what people say." "Yeah," Darlene called back, "and people say too much." Still, neither woman went inside. "Old Mrs. Lockett, who preferred bluntness to pretense, spoke up from her porch swing. "Every time that animal carries on like this, somebody dies." Martha threw up both hands. "It's a dog, not the angel of death." That got a weak laugh, but no one sounded easy. The howling dragged on until the night seemed stretched too tight over the whole road. Then sometime before dawn it stopped. By breakfast the next morning, word was already moving through Greene County faster than sense ever did. Sharon Cole was dead. They found her near the old well behind the crumbling place where she had been living off and on a sagging house hidden behind weeds and neglect. The sheriff's vehicle had barely pulled away before the story reached the Dollar General, the church parking lot, the gas station, and then the rest of the county. Poor Sharon. Lord, what a life. Maybe it was for the best. People used those phrases when they did not want to say the uglier ones aloud. Sharon had spent years exhausting pity and confirming judgment in equal measure. Too many men, too much liquor, too many children by too many fathers, and not enough steadiness to keep a single decent thing alive once it fell into her hands. By the time the funeral was held near Greenville 2 days later, half the people in the room had come, because funerals in small places were still a form of attendance, while the other half had come because curiosity wore black just as easily as grief. Then Natalie Harper walked in, and the room shifted. She had driven in from Knoxville in a dark dress that fit the occasion without trying to impress anyone. She was striking, but not in the soft, decorative way people expected. It was the composure they noticed first, the stillness, the way she moved as if she already knew she was being looked at and had made peace with it before arriving. Some whispered that they could see Sharon around the mouth. Others said no, maybe in the eyes, maybe not even there. More than one person watched Natalie speak to the funeral director, sign the papers, thank people, and keep everything moving with a calm Sharon herself had never possessed, and that unsettled them more than if she had wept openly. "She's handling it like family," one woman murmured. "She is family," another replied. "That's not what I meant." Natalie heard enough to catch the tone, even when the words blurred. She had not come to correct anyone. Sharon Cole had never truly mothered her, but death had a way of reducing complicated histories to one blunt fact: somebody had to show up, and she had. She accepted condolences she did not need, thanked women who had once watched her childhood from a safe distance, and stood through the service with her hands folded and her face steady. At the graveside, as dirt tapped softly against the lowered casket, she heard a sentence drift from behind her. "Pretty as she is, a woman said under her breath, blood tells eventually." Natalie did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the grave until the last prayer was said and the last hand had been shaken. By all appearances, she had done what duty required. But when she finally reached her car, she did not point it toward Knoxville. She sat for a moment, with both hands on the wheel, listening to the last scraps of small-town whispering caught in memory. Then started the engine, and turned deeper into the county where Sharon had lived, and where her own life had begun. Instead of heading back toward Knoxville, Natalie took the narrower roads that curved away from Greenville, and toward the part of Greene County she remembered more by feeling than by map. The farther she drove, the more the landscape seemed to rise out of some older layer of herself. Leaning mailboxes, patchy fields, porches buckling at the corners, ditches overgrown with weeds tall enough to hide what had been thrown into them. Sharon's old place looked smaller than it had in Natalie's mind, which somehow made it worse. The front steps had sunk unevenly. One shutter hung by a single hinge. The yard had long ago given up being a yard and become rough ground with ambitions of swallowing the house whole. Natalie sat in the car a moment longer before getting out. She told herself she was only here to see it once and be done to put shape around something that had lived in her in fragments for years. The front door gave under her hand with almost no resistance. The smell hit her first, a layered thing built of mildew-old food, damp wood, stale air, and whatever misery had soaked into the walls too long to ever come out. The living room was dim in daylight. A stained recliner sagged in one corner. A lamp leaned sideways beside the couch. The curtains were yellowed with old smoke. Natalie stood in the middle of that room, and for one quick second, the years slipped. She was little again, trying not to make too much noise because Sharon was sleeping one off on the couch or not sleeping, which could be worse. There had always been men in and out, boots by the door, a laugh she didn't know, the television too loud, ashtrays full, Sharon's voice cutting sharp across the room. Quit whining, sit down, stop getting into things. There had never been much room in that house for a child to be frightened. Fear was treated like inconvenience there. Natalie moved into the kitchen, linoleum peeled back near the sink. A cabinet door hung open. She found herself staring at the empty space beside the back door, where a memory came back so suddenly it seemed to strike, bare feet on a cold floor. A winter morning not yet light. Sharon yanking on her own jacket, but not reaching for Natalie's. A man at the table laughing into a coffee mug. Natalie crying because her feet hurt. Sharon telling her to stop acting spoiled. The memory did not arrive whole. They never did. Only flashes. A hand jerking her by the shoulder. Hunger treated as annoyance. The feeling that pain, if it lasted long enough, might finally make somebody come running. Nobody had. Natalie stepped back outside before the walls could say more. Beyond the wild patch behind the house, the little lake still flashed silver through the trees. She walked toward it, almost without deciding to. Standing there, she let another part of the past come forward. Years earlier, Richard Harper had crossed paths with Sharon during a short business trip through East Tennessee. It had meant little to Sharon, and not much at first to him. Then, Martha Pritchard, through one cousin and one church friend and one old county contact after another, managed to get word to Knoxville that Sharon Cole had a little girl, and by the timing of it, that little girl might be Richard Harper's child. Richard had not believed it immediately. Natalie had never blamed him for that. Men with money heard stories like that all the time. But Martha kept calling, not begging, only reporting. The child was outside in weather she shouldn't have been in. The child looked hungry too often. The child was being raised in a place where too many things were breaking, and nothing was being fixed. Richard came down himself. He established paternity the legal way. Then, because decent men sometimes wanted to believe decency could still be bought into a bad situation, he started by sending money. It did not take long to understand the truth. Whatever he sent Sharon was not becoming stability for Natalie. It was becoming more Sharon. After that he moved carefully, not recklessly, through child welfare, through the court, through every ugly, slow step required to prove what should have been obvious on sight, that Natalie was being neglected, that Sharon could not keep her safe, and that leaving her there any longer would be its own kind of cruelty. By the time Richard brought her out for good, Natalie had been too young to understand paperwork or legal orders. She only understood that one life had ended and another had begun. Standing by the lake now, she thought of the women at the funeral, lowering their voices over Sharon's grave and mentioning the other children Sharon had left behind. Not just her, others. Somewhere in the Tennessee foster care system, Sharon's damage had continued after Natalie was taken out. And now, that thought would not let her go. Natalie did not wait long. Within days of Sharon's funeral, she was in Greenville, speaking to county staff, caseworkers, and whoever else would tell her what the rules were and what the rules would permit. The offices were beige and overlit and smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. She did not walk in and demand information as if blood alone could unlock a system built around minors and liability. She filled out forms, provided identification, explained the family connection as far as records could support it, waited while calls were made, waited while somebody higher up decided whether limited supervised contact with half-siblings was appropriate. It was not quick and it was not warm, but eventually the wall opened enough for her to pass through. Sharon had left behind more children than most people in the county even realized, and the children were not all in one place. Tennessee had done what systems did when chaos outran rescue. It had divided them by age, by need, by bed space, by whichever placement had said yes at the right moment. Victor was the oldest, then Tanya, then Ethan and Parker, Lena after them. Aiden, still the youngest, was placed separately because he needed a different level of care. Natalie began the visits slowly under supervision at first, in rooms designed to pretend they were not holding generations of damage in folding chairs and weak lighting. The first meeting was stiff from the start. Victor sat forward as if expecting trouble. Tanya watched with sharp, steady eyes that made her seem older than she was. Ethan and Parker looked between them all, waiting to see what kind of scene this would turn into. Lena stayed mostly quiet. Aiden, when Natalie saw him later, under a different roof, studied her with the uncomplicated suspicion of a child too young to make politeness a habit. They all knew Sharon was dead. The workers had told them. None of them cried over it in front of Natalie, and that stayed with her more than anything else. Not hardness, exactly, more like vacancy where grief should have been. They had lost a mother in the legal sense, but not in the way children were meant to lose mothers. Natalie did not insult them by pretending otherwise. "I came because I'm your sister," she said during one of those first visits, her hands still in her lap. "And because I should have come sooner, even if I didn't know how." Victor shrugged without lifting his eyes. "Didn't know we existed." "Not all of you," Natalie said. Tanya looked at her for a long moment. "You from Knoxville." "Yes, must be nice." The sentence had an edge, but the voice under it was younger than it wanted to be. Natalie did not rush to deny the difference between them. "It is," she said. "And I know why that's hard to hear from me." That landed better than pity would have. Over the next visits, the stiffness eased by degrees. Victor liked engines more than conversation. Tanya noticed everything. Ethan and Parker fought sometimes because boys crammed into uncertainty usually did. Lena wanted to know whether Knoxville had good stores. Aiden cared most about the snacks Natalie brought, and little else. Natalie did not make grand promises. She knew too much about disappointment for that. "I'll stay in touch," she told them. "I'll help where I can. And when you're older, when you're in a place to choose your own life, I won't leave you standing there alone trying to figure it out." Victor looked down at the card with her number on it. Tanya held hers like she had not yet decided whether keeping it would make her foolish. Back in Knoxville that evening, Natalie told Richard and Linda everything. Richard listened with the practical stillness he always wore when love walked into a problem carrying no blueprint. "Natalie," he said, "at last, you can't save every child Sharon brought into this world." "No," she said, "but I can stop pretending they aren't there." Linda, one hand around a mug of tea, said quietly, "That is not the same thing as trying to save everyone." Richard exhaled. "It becomes close enough when it starts costing you your peace." Before Natalie could answer Derek, still the attentive fiancé, everyone trusted, then leaned back in his chair and said with just a little too much casual ease, "I just don't see how tying yourself to all of that helps anything." Linda looked over at him. "All of that," Derek lifted one shoulder. "You know what I mean." Natalie did know. That was what unsettled her. Because his tone had been mild and his face open, but the wording stayed wrong long after the conversation moved on. The months that followed settled into the kind of life people pointed to when they wanted proof that things could turn out well after all. Natalie and Derek married in Knoxville under soft spring light, with Linda fussing over flowers and guest cards, and Richard pretending not to fuss while checking that everything had been done right. It was not a huge wedding by the standards of families who treated money as theater, but it was elegant, orderly, and full of the sort of guests whose presence quietly confirmed that the Harper name meant something in that part of Tennessee. If anyone noticed that Derek watched the room a little too closely that day, measuring who greeted Richard first and who spoke to Natalie with deference, they read it as pride. Ambition in a young man marrying into a successful family business was not considered a flaw if it wore a good suit and said "yes, ma'am" at the right moments. Derek did. He wore charm the way some men wore cologne daily, lightly, and with practice. By then, Richard's company had grown well beyond what people in Greene County would have called a shop. There was the manufacturing side, the Knoxville showroom contracts, delivery schedules, office staff, payroll vendors, and the steady rhythm of a business built over years rather than invented overnight. Richard took real pleasure in seeing it hold. Derek learned fast, and that pleased him. "Kid pays attention," Richard said once over dinner after Derek had started taking on more responsibility. "That already puts him ahead of half the people I've hired." Derek smiled modestly into his glass. "I've got a good teacher." It was the right answer. Linda smiled. Natalie smiled too, because at that point she still believed the smile belonged there. From the outside, their life developed the kind of polish that made other people either warmly admiring or quietly envious. Natalie had a husband rising in the company parents who loved her without reservation and a home life that looked grounded and secure. Holidays were held at the Harper's place or at Richard and Linda's depending on the season and who was cooking what. There were long tables, soft lamps, rich food, easy conversation, and the traffic of a family used to one another's habits. Summer dinners on the patio. Thanksgiving with too much food and Richard insisting on carving while everybody waited. Linda setting out desserts as if feeding people properly were a moral principle. Natalie moved through those years with genuine gratitude. She was not sleepwalking through happiness or taking it for granted. She knew exactly what kind of life she had been spared, and exactly what kind had been handed to her instead. She also kept her word. Quietly, without making a production of it, she stayed in contact with Victor and Tanya as they moved into adulthood. Victor did turn out to be the sort of young man who liked engines better than conversation. Tanya stayed sharp, observant, and harder to fool than most adults around her noticed. Natalie helped where she could without making either of them feel like charity. School expenses, practical things, a little money at the right time, advice when they asked for it, silence when they did not. She did not drag them into the center of Harper family life, partly because she sensed they would have hated that, and partly because Derek's face always changed just slightly when they came up. Never enough for anyone else to call it out, enough for her to notice. One evening after she mentioned that Victor might need help getting into a training program, Derek set down his fork and said, "You know there's helping, and then there's signing yourself up for a lifetime of cleanup." Natalie looked at him. "He's not cleanup. That's not what I said. It's what you meant." Derek leaned back, smiling in that patient way he used when he wanted irritation to look like reason. "Natalie, I'm just saying there has to be a line. You can't bring every complication from Sharon Cole's life into ours and act surprised when it follows you into the house." Linda, carrying in a dish from the kitchen, paused just long enough for the silence to register before she set it down. Richard said, "Those kids didn't choose where they started," Derek replied with a small, practiced shrug. "Neither did any of us." The moment passed because so many moments did in good families that wanted to stay good. 5 years moved that way. Through dinners, workdays, promotions, ordinary errands, business conversations, quiet weekends, and photographs that would later hurt to look at. Derek became more deeply embedded in Richard's operations, and more trusted by people who believed competence revealed character. Natalie learned when to let a subject drop, and when to keep one hand on it anyway. Victor and Tanya moved further into their own lives. Everything looked not just stable, but blessed. There was only one thing missing. At first, people asked about it lightly with the cheerful intrusiveness families often mistook for love. Later, they stopped asking so directly, which was worse. Rooms shifted around the subject. Someone would mention a friend's baby and then glance away too quickly. A holiday would end, and Natalie would stand in the kitchen, after everyone left surrounded by plates and candle stubs and the warmth of a full house, and feel the shape of that absence more sharply because everything else had turned out so well. She had love, she had security, she had a place, but she did not have a child, and over time that empty space stopped being only sorrow. It became a pressure point. By the 5th year of their marriage, Natalie and Derek had grown used to airport specialist offices and the careful, neutral expressions of doctors, who had learned how to disappoint people without sounding cruel. They had done the local appointments first, then Nashville and Atlanta, then the out-of-state consultations with impressive credentials, polished brochures, and price tags large enough to make even comfortable people sit up straighter. Tests were repeated. Imaging was ordered and reordered. Hormones were measured. Options were explained, then softened, then explained again. Every new office seemed to offer one variation on the same answer. There were possibilities, but no certainty. Treatments, but no guarantees. Hope, but only in language cautious enough to protect everyone except the woman hearing it. Natalie came home from those trips quieter each time. She did not fall apart dramatically. Her grief settled elsewhere, into the pauses between ordinary things, into the way her hand sometimes rested over her stomach at the kitchen sink, into the way she lingered in nursery aisles longer than she meant to. Derek never mocked her pain. In some ways, that would have been simpler. He treated it as a subject to move around efficiently. He came to appointments when necessary, sat through consultations, asked practical questions, and drove them home in silence afterward, with his jaw tight and one hand tapping once against the wheel before going still. He did not give speeches about sons or legacy, but every time the doctor stopped short of certainty, something in him seemed to pull inward, as though the answer offended him even when he kept his face under control. Natalie noticed that. She noticed everything. One evening after another long trip home, Linda found her in the den at Richard and Linda's house with a cup of tea she was no longer drinking. She sat down beside her and waited before speaking the way she always had when entering a silence. "You don't have to keep proving anything," she said quietly. Natalie managed a tired half-smile. "I'm not proving anything." Linda looked at her over the rim of her glasses. "Then what are you doing, sweetheart?" Natalie let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Trying not to become the kind of woman people pity in grocery stores, Linda reached over and smoothed a strand of hair back from her face. "There are other ways to have a family." Natalie knew what she meant before the words came. Adoption, Linda said. Guardianship, maybe, depending on the children. Or simply making room for people who already belong to you. Natalie stared ahead. The idea was not new. It had been sitting in the back of her mind for years, waiting for the day grief made room for courage. "I think about them all the time," she admitted. "I know," Linda said. She knew the difference between a woman grabbing at children because she was desperate and a woman circling a responsibility she already felt in her bones. Derek's answer when the subject was raised later was smoother than refusal had any right to be. He stood in their kitchen loosening his tie after work, listening with that controlled attentiveness he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "Natalie," he said at last, "I understand why you feel connected to them. I do. But that doesn't mean bringing all of that into our home is wise." "All of that," she repeated. He glanced at her. "You know what I mean." "No," she said. "I know what those words usually mean when people say them." Derek exhaled lightly. "I'm saying we need to think about the life we're building. Stability matters. Structure matters. And your siblings, especially the younger ones, have had difficult starts. That doesn't disappear because we decide to be noble about it." Natalie leaned one shoulder against the counter. "You hear children and think burden." "I hear risk," Derek said. He did not soften that one. The silence afterward stretched just long enough to become informative. Natalie did not press further that night. She kept helping anyway because help did not always require permission, and because by then Victor and Tanya were old enough for the support to look practical rather than dramatic. Victor needed a real path, so she helped him into training that matched the way his hands and mind worked. Tanya wanted into healthcare, and then toward clinical work. Natalie helped with books, fees, certifications, and the little costs that could knock a young woman off course if nobody stepped in at the right time. Richard saw more than he commented on. Once, while the two of them were going over numbers at the office, he said, "You've got your mother's heart." Natalie looked up. "Which one?" He smiled, without looking away from the report in front of him. "The one that stayed." By autumn, the shape of the problem was clear, even if nobody said it bluntly. Natalie and Derek were no longer simply disappointed. They were no longer walking toward the same idea of family. She believed care could make a life real. He kept a colder ledger in his head. And yet, life on the surface remained gracious. The Harper house still filled with laughter. Richard still talked expansion. Linda still set places for dinner, as if good food could keep a family stitched together. Natalie still loved them all enough to believe maybe love would hold. So when they planned a quiet evening at Richard and Linda's, nothing grand, just family food and one more gentle attempt to enjoy what was still theirs, it felt almost like relief. No one there knew it yet, but that dinner would be the last time the whole structure stood unbroken. That evening at Richard and Linda Harper's house felt so ordinary in its happiness that Natalie would later keep returning to it against her will. The weather had softened after a run of stubborn heat, and Richard insisted they eat outside. He had the grill going before sunset, one hand working the tongs, the other balancing a drink he kept forgetting to put down. Linda moved in and out of the kitchen with the calm authority of a woman who had long ago accepted that feeding people properly was one of the ways she loved them. Patio lights came on as the sky dimmed, and the whole backyard settled into that warm, expensive ease money could buy only after years of discipline had already built the life underneath it. Victor and Tanya came by for part of the evening, still carrying a little of the stiffness they always seemed to feel around polished spaces, though less than before. Richard made Victor laugh twice, which took some doing. Linda pressed leftovers on Tanya before the meal was even over because Linda trusted appetite less than she trusted preparation. Derek was in especially good form that night, attentive, easy, useful, without looking performative. He helped Richard with the grill-carried dishes, topped off glasses, and knew just when to step back and let the older man feel like the head of the family in his own house. Natalie noticed all of it, and because she still loved him then, she took those details in as proof of something good. At one point, Richard leaned back in his chair and looked around the table with the open satisfaction of a man who had spent most of his life building and could still appreciate what had been built. "This," he said, lifting his glass, "matters a whole lot more than quarterly numbers." Derek smiled. "Don't let the office hear you say that." Linda laughed. "That attitude is exactly why no one in that building ever relaxes," Richard said. "They're not paid to relax." Victor, under his breath but not quite low enough, said, "I think it's both," and even Richard laughed at that. Later, after Victor and Tanya had left and the dishes were mostly cleared, the four of them sat out longer while the night settled around the yard. It was one of those pauses families rarely recognized while living through them. Nothing dramatic, nothing staged, only the easy presence of people sure they belonged to one another. No one said they were making a memory. The next morning broke clean and bright. Natalie was still upstairs when Richard's phone rang. She heard the shift in his voice before she heard the words. "What do you mean the system's down?" By the time she came into the kitchen, he was already moving fast. Coffee abandoned, reading glasses, forgotten on the counter. Linda stood near the island listening. Richard looked up. "They're saying there's some kind of major issue at the office. Servers files the whole thing. Nobody can access what they need." Derek, who had come in behind Natalie, frowned as though the problem had personally offended him. "Who called one of the staff?" Richard said. She sounded half out of her mind. Natalie reached for the back of a chair. "Do you want me to come?" "No." Richard was already grabbing his keys. "There's no reason for all of us to turn this into a parade." "I'm going with you," Linda said. Richard glanced at her. "Linda, I'm going," she repeated, and that was that. Derek rubbed the back of his neck. "I'd come too, but I'm not much use if it's really tech-related. I was up half the night. Think I overdid it on the bourbon." Richard waved it off impatiently. "Stay put, then. No sense all of us stumbling around down there." Natalie still did not like it. Later, she would replay that feeling too small ordinary resistance, rising for no reason she could explain. She watched Richard and Linda leave. She remembered the sound of the front door closing. She remembered thinking they would be back before lunch. They were not. Less than an hour later, her phone rang from an unfamiliar number. "Natalie Harper," a man asked when she answered. The voice was official, in the worst way controlled, already carrying bad news. Something in her body knew before her mind did. Yes, there's been an accident. She did not remember all of what came after in order, only fragments, single vehicle rollover, a road outside Knoxville. The impossible pause before the man said they had not survived. Derek crossing the room toward her as her knees gave, a sound coming out of her she did not recognize. The days after moved in bursts of unbearable clarity and total blur. There were officers, forms, calls she did not know how she made, and the awful business-like efficiency of death in America. The crash was handled the way crashes often were when the story looked simple enough to satisfy everyone involved. Richard had alcohol residue in his blood from the evening before. He had swerved after another vehicle cut too close, according to the initial account. There was no obvious appetite to push deeper. She tried once in the middle of those first shattered days to hold on to one detail that felt wrong. Someone at the company said there had been no major systems failure that morning, no server collapse, no catastrophic loss of files, nothing that should have dragged Richard out the door with that kind of urgency. Natalie heard it. She understood it. Then grief rolled over her again so hard that the thought went under before she could anchor it. At the funeral, 2 caskets stood side by side beneath arrangements. Linda would have found tasteful, and Richard would have said, cost too much. This room felt nothing like Sharon Cole's service. There was real sorrow here, real standing in the aisle because there were not enough seats, company people, friends, neighbors, men Richard had mentored, women Linda had fed. Victor and Tanya came too, trying to be useful in the face of something too large to help with. Derek stayed near Natalie constantly, a hand at her elbow, a low voice in her ear, the image of the devoted husband under strain. Patricia and Martin Sullivan arrived, wearing expressions of carefully arranged devastation. They embraced Natalie, embraced Derek, spoke in hushed tones about tragedy and family and getting through this together. Even through the fog, something about them began to feel off. Not one thing she could name. A collection of moments that did not fit. The way Patricia's eyes traveled over the house when people gathered there afterward. The way Martin asked practical questions too quickly, as if logistics interested him more than mourning. The way Derek began answering for Natalie before she had the strength to notice he was doing it. By the end of funeral week, Natalie had lost more than the 2 people in those caskets. She had lost the structure of her life, the people who believed her by instinct, the moral center of the house, the buffer between her and every colder force in the world. And in the raw, disoriented space their deaths left behind, Derek had already started moving closer to everything that remained. In the first days after Richard and Linda died, people told Natalie to rest, as if rest were still a place she could reach. She moved through the Harper estate in Knoxville like someone who had survived a flood and not yet understood which rooms were gone for good. Richard's glasses still lay where he had left them. Linda's throw still hung over the back of the den sofa. A coffee cup in the cabinet could stop her cold. Derek stepped smoothly into the silence. "You don't need to think about the business right now," he told her more than once, always in that patient husband's voice. "Let me handle the office. Let me handle the calls. Just get through the day." It sounded merciful. At first, it even felt merciful. She let him take meetings she could not sit through, answer emails she could not bear to read, tell employees she needed time because she did. Patricia and Martin started coming by more often after that. They never called it intrusion. They arrived with casseroles, flowers, solemn faces, and lowered voices. Patricia would stand in the kitchen speaking about family and resilience, while her eyes traveled over the cabinetry, the counters, the windows, the silver laid out for company that was not coming. Martin had the habit of pausing in doorways and looking around as if measuring things. Natalie noticed it, but grief had made her slow in strange places. By the time a thought reached clarity, another wave usually rolled over it and pushed it under. She tried to return to the office once around 3 weeks in because guilt finally outweighed paralysis for an afternoon. The Knoxville showroom was bright and polished as ever the office side, humming with that careful order Richard had always insisted on. For one foolish second, she thought routine might save her. Then, she saw Derek in Richard's office, not sitting there casually, settled there. His laptop was open on the desk. His jacket hung over the back of Richard's chair. A legal pad with his handwriting sat beside one of Richard's old fountain pens. The room itself had not changed much, but the center of gravity had. Derek looked up when she appeared in the doorway, surprise crossing his face so quickly it might have passed for concern. "And Natalie, you should have called. I would have come out." She looked around the room instead of at him. "I didn't know you'd moved in. It's temporary," he said, "only because everything's coming through here right now." A little later, Aaron Mills from IT stopped by with the careful awkwardness of a man who knew enough to be useful and not enough to be safe. He offered condolences again, then glancing toward Richard's office said, "Still, can't believe how that day went." Natalie turned. "What do you mean?" Aaron hesitated. "Just that it all happened over something that wasn't even real." Her exhaustion sharpened. What wasn't real? The emergency call. The server crash. There wasn't one. "We checked everything twice that morning because people kept asking. No major outage. No lost files. Nothing that would have needed your father there like that. The air around her seemed to thin. Before she could ask anything else, Aaron was called away. She stood there with one hand on the edge of a desk, trying to hold on to the thought long enough to think, but Derek was already back beside her, gently steering, gently managing. "You're pale," he said. This was too soon. She heard herself answer. Aaron said there wasn't any systems emergency that morning. Derek exhaled as if he had been waiting for that nuisance to circle back. "Then somebody panicked over nothing and your father overreacted. Natalie, please don't do this to yourself." That night he poured her a drink for the first time in the open. "You need sleep," he said. "You're not going to make it through this if you keep shaking all night." "I don't want it. Take 2 sips." She took 2. The next night he offered wine instead, milder, easier. After that it was bourbon and tea brandy to settle her nerves, another glass, because she had cried herself into a headache, another because she had not eaten, another because every room in the house hurt. It did not happen all at once. That was what made it possible. Derek never said, "Here, become someone else." He said, "Let me help. Let me get you through the evening. Let me quiet your mind long enough for you to sleep." And grief fed the right lie often enough will begin to cooperate. Natalie had never been much of a drinker. Soon she was reaching for the glass before he offered it. Soon the evenings blurred at the edges. Soon mornings began later. Calls went unanswered. Texts sat unopened. The company became something happening elsewhere, run by other hands, in a language she no longer trusted herself to speak. Elena Ruiz saw more of it than anyone. She carried trays upstairs and found half-finished glasses on nightstand side tables, once on the bathroom counter beside Natalie's toothbrush. She watched Derek guide conversation away from work, away from paperwork, away from anything requiring steadiness. She watched Patricia and Martin grow more comfortable in the house, with every visit their sympathy thinning as their confidence thickened. But Elena was an employee in a house that no longer felt safe for honesty, so she said too little. By the end of the second month, Derek had begun to look at Natalie with a private satisfaction. He was careful to hide from others. He thought she was slipping beyond resistance. He thought the house had closed tightly enough around her. He thought the unanswered calls meant the outside world had lost its grip. He did not know Tanya had been calling for days, and when Tanya stopped getting answers, she made up her mind to come in person. Tanya did not bother with front door niceties. By the time the guard realized she was not planning to wait politely in the driveway, she was already inside, moving fast with the kind of blunt determination that had always made people underestimate her, right up until they discovered they had not stopped her. Elena Ruiz met her halfway down the hall, startled, one hand still holding a dish towel. "Miss Cole, you can't just—" "Where is she?" Tanya snapped. Something in her face must have answered the question for Elena, because the protest died into a glance upstairs. "Bedroom. She's been in there most of the day." Tanya did not wait. The room smelled faintly of stale air perfume, gone sour, and liquor. Natalie was on the bed in wrinkled clothes that were not really pajamas and not really daytime clothes, either, with an open bottle on the nightstand beside a glass. For one beat, Tanya only stared. Then she crossed the room, took the bottle first, and set it hard on the dresser. Natalie flinched. "What?" "It's me," Tanya said. "Sit up." Natalie moved her arm and blinked against the light. Her face was puffier than Tanya had ever seen it, wrong in a way that made anger climb clean and hot through her chest. "You look awful," Tanya said. Then, because she was not good at softening anything in the first minute, she added, "No, actually scratch that. You look like he's been killing you slowly in this house." Natalie stared at her as if the sentence had taken too long to cross the fog she was sitting in. "Tanya, yes, Tanya. Get up. I can't." "Sure you can." What followed was not graceful. Tanya half-walked, half-dragged her, threw a shower-bullied coffee into her, and got her into the car before Derek came home. An hour later, they were in a small cafe far enough from the estate to feel like neutral ground. Tanya waited until they were seated in the back before she spoke. "I need you to stay with me." Natalie gave a tired exhale. "You dragged me out of my own house. I'm with you." "No, I mean, really with me." Something in Tanya's tone cut through the residue still clinging to Natalie's thoughts. She straightened a little. "All right." Tanya pulled out her phone. "At the clinic, a woman came in a few days ago. Her name was Courtney Blake. Natalie went still. "She's pregnant," Tanya said. "Very pregnant." And she was talking about Derek like he was hers already. About how he just had to clear up some financial complications and then everything would be easier. Natalie's face changed, not dramatically, but with the terrible precision of someone hearing truth fit into place where denial had been doing weak, expensive work. "Tanya, I'm not done." Tanya unlocked her phone and turned it toward her. The photo had been taken outside the clinic. Not perfect, not pretty, but clear enough. Derek, one arm around Courtney Blake, his head bent toward her with a look Natalie knew too well because she had once believed it belonged to her. For a second, Natalie did not speak. Then she sat back and set her coffee down carefully as though anything breakable in the world suddenly required caution. "He's having an affair," she said. "Yes. And she's pregnant." "Yes." Natalie nodded once. Her voice, when it came again, was quieter. "That should be the worst part." Tanya leaned forward. "It's not." "No," Natalie said, looking past her through the room. "It's not." Once she said it aloud, the whole thing changed shape in front of her. The affair hurt, the baby hurt. But deeper than either was the pattern she could finally see if she stopped excusing each piece separately. Derek had not merely failed her while she grieved. He had managed her grief, directed it, fed it, turned her into someone slower, softer, easier to override. "He wanted me out of the way," Natalie said. Tanya did not interrupt. "He kept me home, kept me drinking, kept me too tired to think, too blurry to go near the company." She looked back at Tanya and there was something cold in her eyes now, something steadier than pain. "Oh my God." "Yeah," Tanya said. "That." By the time Natalie returned to the estate that night, she was no longer trying to understand what had happened to her. She was trying to understand how much Derek thought he had already gotten away with. So she gave him what he expected. She let her shoulders sag. She answered slowly. She left a glass by the bed with enough whiskey in it to smell convincing. Then when the house settled, she stayed awake. Near midnight, she heard Derek on the downstairs phone, his voice low and pleased. "No, she's not seeing any of it. I told you everything's on track. I'll deal with the paperwork soon." Paperwork. Natalie stood just inside the hallway shadow and listened until the call ended. When she turned back, Elena Ruiz was there at the far end of the corridor, frozen with a stack of folded towels in her arms. For a second, both women simply looked at each other. Then Elena came closer and lowered her voice. "They've been here a lot. Your in-laws, talking in corners, walking through the house like they're waiting for it to become theirs." Natalie did not answer right away. She was listening to the blood in her own ears. Derek was betraying her, manipulating her, planning something with documents. But, standing there in the dark, she understood one thing more frightening than all the rest. She still did not know whether he wanted only divorce the company, the estate, or whether the lie that sent Richard and Linda onto that road had started with him too. Natalie did not make the mistake of confronting Derek, while anger still felt hot enough to be useful. Heat was what he expected. Tears, maybe. A smashed glass. A desperate accusation he could deny, reverse, and file away as proof that she was unstable. So she gave him the opposite. She drifted through the days in the same loose, dulled shape he had taught himself to trust. She let her responses come half a beat late. She kept a bottle visible often enough to reassure him. And when she needed to move without being watched, she used the one person Derek still did not know how to account for, Victor. He picked her up on his days off, in an old sedan that looked exactly like what it was dependable enough to run, forgettable enough not to be remembered. Natalie never asked him to pull through the main gate. She walked out of the estate grounds in soft clothes and dark sunglasses, waited until the guard lost interest, then cut across to the next street where Victor was already idling. The first time they followed Derek, neither of them spoke much. They sat half a block from the Knoxville office district and watched employees come and go under clean glass and polished signage while Victor pretended to scroll his phone. When Courtney Blake stepped out, Natalie recognized her immediately. Derek appeared behind her, carrying himself with the same smooth efficiency he brought to boardrooms and funerals. He touched Courtney lightly, at the elbow opened the passenger side door, and bent toward her with a look Natalie knew by heart because she had once believed it belonged to love. "You want me to go after them?" Victor asked. "Yes," Natalie said. They followed at a distance until Derek pulled into the underground garage of a building Natalie recognized with a jolt. "That's mine," she said. "What? That condo? It's part of my holdings. Richard bought it years ago for company use." They watched Derek escort Courtney inside, as if showing a wife into her own home. The affair itself no longer felt like the center of the crime. It was simply one room in a larger house. He was using her property. He was moving assets around her life as if she were already gone. "You need somebody who does this for real," Victor said on the drive back. "I know," Natalie answered. That was how she ended up in Zachary Reed's office 3 mornings later, sitting across from a man whose desk was neat, without looking staged, and whose questions began in the right place. Not with sympathy, with sequence. "When did your husband become harder to track financially?" "When my parents died." "When did he start encouraging the drinking immediately after?" "When did you first hear there was no systems emergency that morning?" "Within weeks. I was too far gone to hold on to it." Zachary wrote something down, glanced up and said, "That doesn't make you foolish. It makes you the intended target." He worked the case the way certain people worked, faith quietly, methodically, without advertising conviction, before it had earned itself. He started with the crash. He pulled what he could on the vehicle history, the post-crash, handling the initial assumptions. Then he widened the circle. Patricia and Martin Sullivan came next. Public records, debt exposure, property sales, the shape of money when it was trying to leave a sinking life without being seen. What he found was not elegant. That was the point. The Sullivans were broke, not cash tight, not between investments, bankrupt in everything but posture. They had sold off what mattered shed appearances where they could and were living on performance and whatever Derek was feeding back into the family machine. Peter Collins filled in the rest from inside the company. He did not come to Natalie directly at first. He came to Zachary cautiously, like a man deciding whether conscience had arrived too late to be respectable. He confirmed what numbers had already begun to suggest. The company was still profitable, but large pieces of revenue were bleeding out through inflated expenses, suspicious vendor payments, and transfers that made no operational sense. Under Richard, Peter said, hands folded too tightly around his coffee cup, "We watched every dollar because he respected what it took to earn one." Under Derek, money disappears with paperwork attached to it. Through all of it, Natalie kept acting her part. She let Derek think her evenings dissolved into amber and blur. She let Patricia speak too sweetly at her and Martin pace through rooms with ownership in his posture. Elena, seeing more than she ever said aloud, began leaving information in small, useful pieces, a date, a visit, a conversation cut off when someone entered. Then one night, Derek lost patience. He came into the bedroom with a folder in his hand, and that careful look men wore when they had decided force sounded better if it arrived, dressed as inconvenience. "I need you to sign a few things," he said. Natalie, in bed with a glass near enough to smell convincing, looked up slowly. "What things? Routine business matters. Authority updates. Temporary approvals." He set the folder on the blanket. "You can barely function right now, Natalie. Let me make this easier." She let the pages blur in front of her, then leaned back and let her head tip toward the pillow. "Tomorrow." Derek's mouth tightened. "No, tonight." She did not move. He stood there a second longer, then swore, softly picked up his phone and walked into the hall. Natalie kept her breathing heavy until his footsteps faded. Then she slipped from the bed and went to the doorway in silence. His voice carried just enough. "If she won't sign voluntarily, then we document the condition." "Yes. Alcohol dependency, impaired judgment, risk factors, whatever needs to be built. I want this handled fast. Built. Not assessed. Built." Natalie felt the floor tilt under her. Not with grief this time, but with the clean terror of understanding exactly how close she was to losing everything that could still legally be called hers. Not just the company, not just the estate, her standing, her credibility, her right to say no and have it matter. When Derek ended the call, she was already back in bed, limp and breathing through her mouth. But now she knew the timeline had collapsed. By morning, he might have the start of a record strong enough to lock her inside his version of her own life. She had the folder, partial evidence, no car, no keys, and a house already tightening around her. There was only one move left. She had to run before Derek turned paperwork into a cage. Natalie moved before fear had time to become hesitation. She took the folder Derek had brought upstairs, shoved it into a tote bag, grabbed the second phone Zachary had told her to keep charged, and slipped out through the service corridor in the back of the house. Elena Ruiz met her at the kitchen door as if she had been waiting for this exact moment without ever daring to say so. "He hid your car keys weeks ago," Elena whispered. "I checked everywhere I could." Natalie nodded once. "I know." Elena pulled a light jacket off a hook and pressed it into her hands. "Go through the side gate. The guard does rounds every 20 minutes. For 1 second, they looked at each other in the yellow half-light of the kitchen, two women standing inside a house that no longer felt like shelter. "Thank you," Natalie said. Elena shook her head hard, already close to tears. "Just go." Natalie crossed the dark edge of the property on foot, cut through a stand of trees, and kept moving until the gravel shoulder gave way to weeds beyond the estate cameras. Only then did she call Zachary. He answered immediately. "Tell me where you are." She gave him the nearest mile marker she could see. "Get off the road, into the tree line. Stay low. I'm coming." She waited behind a strip of brush with Derek's folder pressed against her ribs. Once headlights passed too slowly and her whole body locked. Then the vehicle moved on. By the time Zachary pulled up in an unmarked SUV, her hands were shaking so badly she fumbled the door handle twice. At the furnished rental he used when clients needed distance more than comfort, he spread the documents across a dining table, while Natalie sat opposite him with a blanket around her shoulders. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed. These are not temporary approvals. These would have given Derek broader operational control over company assets and created a paper trail to support removing you from decision-making altogether. Natalie stared at him. And after that phone call, he added, "I think he was preparing to build a formal record that you were too impaired to challenge any of it." She leaned back slowly. "So if I'd stayed until morning, you might not have been able to stop what came next." By dawn, Zachary had pushed everything already gathered into motion: Peter Collins's financial evidence, the debt picture on Patricia and Martin, the false emergency call, the document package, Elena's observations, enough at last for law enforcement to stop seeing fragments and start seeing design. The arrest came faster than Derek expected. When officers entered the Harper estate, he tried indignation first, then confusion, then outrage on Natalie's behalf, as if he too were a shocked bystander to some terrible misunderstanding. But performance has limits. Once his devices were seized, once communications lined up against timelines, once the pressure shifted from accusation to corroboration, his confidence began to split. Patricia and Martin lasted even less well under scrutiny. People like them often believed themselves strong because they could lie socially for years. That was not the same as surviving formal questioning once self-interest turned the room. They began by claiming they knew nothing. Then they started correcting one another. Then they explained too much. By the time investigators pressed them against debt records, property sales, and the flow of money from Derek, the family story broke into pieces. It came out ugly, which was fitting. The office emergency, the morning Richard and Linda died, had been staged through a false call. Derek had counted on urgency, on loyalty to the business, on Richard's habit of fixing things himself. The crash itself had not been random either. The exact mechanics mattered less to Natalie than the fact that it had been engineered and then left to look like bad luck, helped along by a little bourbon from the night before. Afterward came the second phase: isolate Natalie, manage her grief, feed the drinking move, money-tighten access, and prepare the legal ground to erase her ability to resist. Courtney Blake was not innocent in it. She had known enough benefited from Derek's diversions and waited for the transfer of life and status as if she were entitled to it. By the time charges settled into place, Natalie felt no cinematic satisfaction, only a deep, exhausted stillness, and the strange disorientation of realizing that a nightmare once named correctly did not become smaller. It only became visible. She returned to the company before she felt ready, because readiness had long ago revealed itself as a luxury. Peter Collins stayed not because his silence had been admirable, but because his records, testimony, and understanding of what Derek had done made him more valuable inside the cleanup than outside it. Natalie removed others where she had to re-signed authority, shut down bad access, and began again. Victor became her driver, soon after which would have made the younger version of him laugh in disbelief. Tanya, by then moving deeper into the medical world she had chosen, remained the sort of sister who called not to ask how someone felt, but whether they had eaten and answered their lawyer. Then came the next ache. Courtney gave birth to a boy and within days walked away from him. The hospital's social worker notified child welfare. The newborn entered emergency protective custody before Tanya brought Natalie the news, angry enough to sound breathless. She signed out and left him, Tanya said. Just left him. Natalie sat with that for a long time before speaking. The child was innocent. That fact arrived first and stayed. She did not rush the decision. She spoke with Zachary. She sat with lawyers, with child welfare staff, with the practical shape of what it would mean to become a kinship placement for a baby born out of treachery. In the end, what moved her was not pity for Courtney or Derek, who deserved none. It was the simple refusal to let one more child become collateral damage in a story built by selfish adults. So, through the proper process, she brought him home. By then, her bond with Zachary had changed into something that no longer needed to pretend it was only strategy and mutual respect. He did not rush her. That was one of the reasons she trusted him. He stood beside her through hearings, restructuring child welfare meetings, and the slow legal steps required to bring the younger Cole children into more stable family arrangements. He proved love the difficult way by showing up repeatedly and correctly without demanding praise for it. The younger Cole children came next. Not all at once, not carelessly, but through home studies, paperwork, waiting periods, court approvals, adjustments, and the kind of persistence real family often required. The house changed with them. Noise replaced hush. Shoes gathered by doors. Someone was always hungry. Someone was always missing a charger. Someone was always laughing too loudly from the next room. And then when Natalie had long since stopped building her future around miracles, one arrived anyway. She became pregnant. Even then, she did not trust it all at once. Not until the appointments held. Not until the months passed. Not until she was finally holding a healthy baby boy against her chest with Zachary beside her and a whole loud, untidy, loyal crowd waiting to meet him. In the end, the life she built did not look like triumph. It looked like dinner plates, homework, a baby crying from the next room, Victor in the driveway, Tanya arguing about something practical, Zachary laughing in the kitchen. Children who had once been scattered now under one roof, or close enough to call it home. Years earlier in Greene County, women had stood near Sharon Cole's grave and wondered whether blood would tell on Natalie in the end. It had, just not the way they meant. What lived on in her was not Sharon's ruin. It was Richard's steadiness, Linda's mercy, her own hard-earned refusal to abandon the vulnerable just because somebody else already had. In the life Natalie built, family was not defined by shame or gossip or whatever damage started a story. It was defined by who stayed, who protected, and who chose love when they finally had the power to choose anything at all.